At this moment, I'd like to take a step back and let's take stock of the situation we find ourselves in. So we've seen lots of examples of different types of voting methods, and we can roughly categorize these voting methods into 4 categories. So first of all, there's the positional scoring rules. And these are voting methods in which the voters provide a linear ranking over all of the candidates or alternatives. And then you use those rankings to assign scores to the different candidates, and the candidate with the highest score, the best score, is declared the winner. Typical examples of these voting methods include Borda count and plurality rule. A second class of voting methods are what we might call the generalized scoring rules. And the idea here is that we allow the voters to directly score the candidates or alternatives. And then we somehow aggregate those scores among all of the voters and determine for each candidate what overall or aggregate score that candidate gets. And then again, the candidate with the highest score, the best score, is declared the winner. Examples of voting methods that fall into this category are approval voting, majority judgment, and range voting. A third class of voting methods are the staged procedures. And here, again, we ask the voters to rank all of the candidates or alternatives. And what happens is that voting proceeds in stages. In each round, we remove one or more of the candidates until we end up in a situation in which only one candidate wins or a set of candidates is tied for the winners. Examples of methods that fall into this category are plurality with runoff, the Hare system, and the Coombs rule. And finally, we have the so-called Condorcet consistent methods. And these are just simply methods that guarantee that a Condorcet winner is elected. Of course, we know that Condorcet winners don't always exist, so the different methods differ in who they elect in situations in which a Condorcet winner doesn't actually exist. So examples of methods that fall into this category are the Copeland rule, Dodson rule, or the Young system or the Young rule. We've also seen many examples of group decision-making principles. These are desirable properties that we would want any group decision-making method to satisfy. So, for example, one principle that we've looked at a lot is the Condorcet principle. This just simply says, elect a Condorcet winner if one actually exists. Second principle is monotonicity. More support should never hurt a candidate. So moving up in the rankings and the voters' ranking should never harm that candidate. A related principle is the principle of participation. It should never be in a voter's best interest to actually not show up to an election. Another principle is the multiple districts principle. If we take our society and we divide it up into disjoint districts, and we hold an election in each one of those districts, and we see that a single candidate turns out to be the winner, one candidate wins all of those different districts, then that candidate should also win when we combine all the districts and run a single election. We've also seen the principle of independence. And this just simply says that the ranking of two alternatives or candidates should depend only on how the voters feel about those two candidates, and not about irrelevant spoiler candidates. And finally, we've seen the principle, the Pareto principle, or the unanimity principle. You should never elect a candidate in which there's unanimous agreement that there's another candidate that's strictly preferred to that first candidate. So never elect a candidate that is dominated. In addition, there are 3 other principles that we haven't talked much about, but they're natural principles to impose. The first is anonymity. No voters you should never privilege any one of the voters. So the outcome shouldn't depend on the names of the voters. A related principle is neutrality, and this just says that the outcome should not depend on the names of the candidates. So no alternative or candidate, for example, the status quo, should be given special privilege. And finally, there's a principle, universal domain. And this is just the idea that we should not restrict the voters' ability to choose any particular ballot or any particular ranking. So we have a number of desirable group principles, and we've seen lots of different voting methods. And the voting, we've seen that it's not the case. So some voting methods don't satisfy some of the principles. So here's a general question. What exactly is the relationship between all of these principles? And can we find a procedure that actually satisfies all of them? If we could, then we could identify that voting methods and really say there'd be a certain sense in which that's the best voting method overall. Well, here's a few observations that we've already come across. So first of all, Condorcet winners may not actually exist. So this is the so-called Condorcet paradox. But even if a Condorcet winner exists, we know that positional scoring rules, there's always situations that a positional scoring rule will not actually elect a Condorcet winner. This is the so-called Condorcet's other paradox. So no positional scoring method will satisfy the Condorcet principle. And finally, we've seen that the Condorcet principle and the participation axiom or participation principle conflict with each other. So this is Moulin's theorem. It says that if you know that a voting method is Condorcet consistent, then there are always situations in which it may be susceptible to the no-show paradox. So these are just a few observations about how these different principles relate to each other and which voting method satisfies which of these principles. But what I'm really interested in now is how can we characterize the different voting methods? And how can we classify the different voting methods that we've seen? And there's different perspectives we could take. So first of all, we can take what you might call an axiomatic perspective. And the idea here is we use these principles that we've identified and we try to use them to characterize or uniquely identify certain classes of voting methods. But we could also take a different perspective and we could characterize or classify the voting methods in terms of how they identify a compromise ordering. Do they come close to some ordering that we would call, or some outcome that we would actually identify as a good compromise ranking? And finally, we could take an epistemic perspective and classify the voting methods in terms of which voting method is most likely to yield the correct choice or the objectively correct ranking over all of the alternatives. So these are three different perspectives you could take about how you go about classifying these different methods of group decision making. And what I have at the end of this video are 3 quotes from very well-known philosophers, economists, and political scientists that help to explain what exactly is at stake with these different approaches to classifying different voting methods.